Okay, so picture this. It's the final years of World War II. And for German engineers, their backs are completely against the wall. They're locked in this desperate race against time, tasked with creating a new generation of wonder weapons, armored vehicles that were supposed to turn the entire tide of the war. This is the story of that frantic innovation, and it's a tale of brilliant designs, absolutely fatal flaws, and these so-called paper panzers that, despite their failures, would actually end up changing tank warfare forever.
In the early days of the war, the Blitzkrieg just tore through Europe, right? And it was spearheaded by thousands of tanks, like the Panzer II. Now you look at it, and sure, it was lightly armed and armored. It was really kind of a stopgap design. But as part of this well-oiled combined arms machine, it was brutally effective. For a while there, it really seemed like the German panzers were absolutely unstoppable. But then, June 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa opens up this vast, brutal new front. And out there, in the mud and the snow of the East, the Wehrmacht runs into an opponent that would change everything they thought they knew about how to build a tank.
So what happened? What could possibly shake the confidence of the world's most feared armored force so completely? Well, the answer would show up on the battlefield, and it sent a shockwave all the way back to the high command in Berlin.
The answer was a revolutionary Soviet design. When the T-34 medium tank first rolled out, it just sent this jolt through the German ranks. They were completely, totally unprepared for what they were now up against.
So this T-34 shock really boils down to a few key things. You had German tankers watching in absolute horror as their shells would just bounce off the T-34's revolutionary sloped armor. And while their own tanks with their narrow tracks were getting hopelessly bogged down, the T-34's wide tracks let it just glide over the brutal mud and snow of the Russian landscape. It was a massive, massive wake-up call.
Germany's response wasn't just to copy the T-34. Oh no, that would have been way too simple. Instead, they decided to over-engineer a solution, and the result was one of the most famous and infamous tanks of the entire war, the Panzer V, better known to all of us as the Panther.
Now, on paper, the Panther was an absolute world beater. Its long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm gun could punch right through a T-34 from well outside the Soviet tank's own effective range. And its thick, sloped frontal armor was designed to be pretty much immune to enemy fire. This thing was built to be Germany's T-34 killer.
The pressure to get it to the front was just immense. Hitler actually delayed the massive summer offensive on the Eastern Front, Operation Citadel, specifically to wait for his new superweapon. The Panther was literally thrown into the fire before it was truly ready.
And its combat debut? It was a catastrophe. Out of the 200 Panthers that were sent into the massive Battle of Kursk, 160 of them were out of action within just a couple of days. And here's the really shocking part. Most of them broke down before they ever even saw combat.
And this really gets to the great paradox of the Panther. It was rushed into production with this over-engineered, completely untested drivetrain. The transmissions constantly failed, engines would overheat, and those complex overlapping road wheels, a classic German design signature, they were a total nightmare on the Eastern Front. They'd get clogged with mud, which would then freeze solid overnight, completely immobilizing the tank. The Panther was a predator crippled by its own complexity.
At the same time, the whole nature of the war was changing. It wasn't just about tank versus tank battles out in open fields anymore. You had this brutal urban warfare in places like Stalingrad and the need to crack heavily fortified lines. And all that demanded a new and sometimes very strange set of specialized tools.
So, meet the Goliath. This thing was basically the great-grandfather of today's unmanned ground vehicles. In an era of giant 45-ton tanks, this was a tiny 650-pound disposable drone, just packed with explosives and sent on a one-way mission.
And for the brutal reality of close-quarters combat, Germany turned to a weapon of pure terror. They took older, obsolete tank chassis like the Panzer II and converted them into flampanzers, mounting powerful flamethrowers to clear out buildings, trenches, and fortified positions with just terrifying efficiency.
But, as innovative as the Goliath was, it was deeply flawed. The operator had to steer it with a joystick connected by this long, vulnerable cable. At a top speed under 10 kilometers an hour, it was just an incredibly easy target, and a single stray bullet could sever that control cable, rendering the whole thing useless. It was really an idea far ahead of its time, but the technology just wasn't there yet. Okay, so now it's late 1944. German industry is collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and a war on two fronts. In a final, desperate act, German tank designers went down two radically different paths for the future of their armored forces.
The first path was one of pure, simple logic. It was called the Entwicklung series, or E-series, and it was a brilliant attempt to fix everything that was wrong with German tank production. Instead of all these unique, complex designs, it proposed a standardized family of vehicles. I mean, imagine a Lego system for tanks, where a light tank destroyer, a medium tank, and a heavy tank would all share the same engines, transmissions, and wheels. The whole point was to make production faster and maintenance way easier.
But while the E-series represented this very rational path forward, there was another, conflicting impulse. It was this obsession with creating an unbeatable, awe-inspiring supertank, a psychological wonder weapon that was really meant to boost morale.
And this was the result, the E-100. At a monstrous 140 tons, it was less of a practical weapon and more of a propaganda piece on tracks. It just sucked up critical resources and engineering talent at a time when Germany desperately needed simple, reliable tanks, not land battleships that could barely even cross a bridge. This was the complete opposite of that rational E-series philosophy.
Well, the war ended before these final gambles could really play out. The E-series remained mostly on the drawing board, what we now call paper panzers. And that single E-100 prototype was captured by the Allies as nothing more than an incomplete haul. So in the end, yeah, they were all failures.
And yet, their legacy is absolutely fascinating. The ideas that were pioneered in these desperate late-war designs ended up being incredibly influential. The Goliath was a clear ancestor of modern unmanned weapons. The E-series dream of standardized parts, that became a fundamental principle of modern military vehicle design. And specific innovations, like the external suspension and the rear drive layout, they actually reappeared in successful post-war tanks from countries like France and Switzerland.
So this leaves us with a really compelling question. These weapons were born from a collapsing regime, and they completely failed to change the war's outcome. But were they just weapons of desperation? Or were they also, somehow, accidental blueprints for the future of armored warfare?